In the heart of a vibrant zoo, colorful balloons float to the sky, creating a charming spectacle. Meanwhile, majestic tigers roam freely within their cages. In the same zoo, you can also see someone cleaning the floor with a mop, even with a sign announcing that the area is dangerous due to the presence of predator animals. This person cleaning the floor is revealed to be a woman responsible for the site's cleaning. She claims to be very lucky since, due to her superior's absence, she had the privilege of being in charge of the predators, even though she usually doesn't like doing other people's work. But in this case, it's different because she really likes predators in general. All the predators are so strong and brute, as well as quite sensual. Because of this, she realizes that they are the ideal animals in this world. Naturally, our young woman started singing during her cleaning duties, having become a zookeeper just to get a glimpse of exotic animals. Suddenly, a hungry predator charged at her, attracted by the smell of food. Obviously, this scared her, making her disbelief in the situation. After this incident, our young woman was abruptly transported to a kind of forest, leading her to believe she was in the safari zone. However, this possibility was soon dismissed as these trees were different from those in the zone. She looks for her cell phone in her pocket, but finds her hands transformed into wings. These wings belong to a crow whose plumage was black. Our protagonist doesn't know if this body transfusion was caused by reincarnation or some type of possession. Obviously, she was quite scared about having turned into a crow abruptly, finding it unfair to have reincarnated as a crow instead of a beautiful princess. Our protagonist also preferred to have reincarnated as a predator animal instead of a mere bird, when suddenly a doctor appeared, claiming she was very unlucky in her reincarnation. Of course, this only made her sadder, causing her to cry. This also made our protagonist question how her life would continue from now on, as her biggest challenge in her new body was getting food like insects and carcasses. In this whole situation, she turns back to God and says she's curious about the taste of these exotic foods. The only thing that comforts our young crow is that her diet also allows for eating nuts or fruits. So to hunt for these foods, she starts to fly for the first time in her new body, feeling liberated and free to fly all over this planet, claiming that living as a bird might have its positives. When suddenly our protagonist hears human voices below with her sharp hearing, she is quite surprised that people are in that forest, which seems so isolated. With this in mind, she plans to convince someone to adopt her as a pet to receive food more easily. However, our young protagonist would be chased, since crows are birds of bad luck. Determined to try to charm the humans, she decides to introduce herself, heading in their direction. But upon arrival, she doesn't encounter people but some kind of humanoid monster. This makes her quite sad due to her rather dire circumstances. As our protagonist loved games and comics in her past life, she realized these monsters were orcs. This makes her realize that the world she was transported to is not Earth, but some fantasy world. The problem is that many fantasy worlds have orcs, which makes her unsure if this new universe belongs to a manhwa or a game. But one thing that relieved our protagonist was the fact she could understand the language of all beings in that world. She also supposed that according to the orc's conversation, there must be a highly skilled human nearby, setting her primary goal to find him as quickly as possible, aiming to help him to receive food and be adopted. She frantically searches for signs of this human who would have killed one of the orcs, when suddenly she finds a blonde man sitting under the shade of a tree. This same human seems to be in a very bad situation, as he was attacked by an unfortunate recklessness. Regretting having accepted the invitation right away after planning to get close to the powerful Count Fallon, formulating the hypothesis that all these events were planned by the fearsome Llewellyn. He also regrets not having been able to awaken the divine powers of the imperial family. But all these reckless actions were based on the urgency of securing stability in his succession to the throne. All this makes him think this would be his end. But something unknown surprised our protagonist. She is sure she has seen this character somewhere. Being scared, our young cleaner produced a typical bird-like grunt. This made the man realize that there was a crow watching him from within the bushes. As mentioned earlier, crows are associated with death, and this made the young prince believe that this apparition was a bad omen. Trembling at the thought that our protagonist was waiting for his death to feed on him, all this made him want to get rid of this unlucky bird immediately. But the young man couldn't make noise due to the presence of the orcs in that region, when suddenly the crow started cawing, drawing a lot of attention. This made the man very irritated with the fact that a stupid bird was trying to cause his death. Suddenly, our protagonist began to fly, aiming to attract the orc's attention away. This action left the man quite perplexed, making him doubt his judgments. Our young woman's plan actually worked as the orcs deduced that the crow was heading towards the man's corpse. The man gets up from the tree and starts moving, even though he is injured. Realizing that the orcs are moving away by following the bird, this made him deduce that the crow was not there to wait for his death but to help him. Everything went according to our protagonist's plan, since she is sure that the prince belongs to some game or novel. So, to find out which universe she is in, it is essential to keep this man alive at all costs. Also feeling embarrassed by the fact that the man is quite handsome. Anyway, he is the only source of information in this new world she was abruptly transported to. In the end, our protagonist led the orcs to a very high cliff, so her intelligence was not affected after her transformation. Now she decides to search for that man once again. Amidst her searches, our protagonist manages to get a fleeting glimpse of a trail of blood. Upon approaching to see, she realizes that this trail can only belong to the prince. In this situation, our protagonist decides to search for herbs that can help stop the bleeding, even though she is not an expert when it comes to using medicinal herbs. Fortunately, our protagonist has a remarkable ability to distinguish edible plants instinctively using the sharp vision of crows. With this advantage, she decides to abandon the whirlwind of thoughts that torment her and focus on her goal. Suddenly, the scene changes, and we find ourselves at the edge of a stunning stream. There, the prince is using a cloth to stanch his wounds. He claims to have been lucky to find a place with running water, since this same water can inhibit the smell of blood, which is essential to avoid the sharp sense of smell of the orcs. But something still seems to trouble our young prince. He wonders why an unknown crow attracted the orcs to another distant location, thus saving him from a cruel fate. He also finds it ironic that a bird symbolizing death has saved him. However, the prince believes that he will not have such luck again, which makes him seek a way to survive alone. When suddenly leaves were dropped from the sky towards the young hare. These plants are known to be excellent herbs used to stop bleeding from wounds. In this surprising situation, he decides to look up to the sky seeking a glimpse of his benefactor. Looking up and managing to see our protagonist who waves with a friendly smile. But the prince still can't believe this, claiming that there is no possibility for a bird to be so intelligent. Faced with this, he begins to formulate hypotheses about the crow's true identity. Maybe it's someone's familiar, a hybrid, or even a polymorphed dragon. After reflecting, the prince concludes that there are 3 possibilities for the bird's identity. First, he decides to discard the familiar hypothesis, since none of the people who could help him have a familiar. Furthermore, hybrids do not like humans, making this possibility unlikely. So, the hypothesis that remains is that the crow is actually a dragon. However, dragons are not known for helping others in this manner. So, why would this unknown bird be helping him? Once again, our protagonist dropped a kind of small fruit on the ground, catching the prince's attention with the intention of offering food. But soon he says that he is not really in the mood to eat that fruit. The crow tries to encourage him by giving a threatening smile in his direction. Since the man is no fool, he realizes that our protagonist seems to understand him, even though she is no longer human. Encouraged by this, he decides to eat the fruit given to him gladly. After eating, the prince evaluates the food, saying that it is sweet enough to create an unforgettable moment. After this, they started helping each other in a sort of collaboration. Our protagonist was responsible for finding fruits and medicinal herbs, as well as warning about the predators in the area. The man was in charge of hunting fish and rabbits to share. Our favorite bird was very relieved by not having to eat insects to survive anymore. And so, after much mutual collaboration, the prince decided to nickname our protagonist Rhinel. He holds the crow in his arms as a way to show his closeness and friendship. This depicts the difference between how the man saw our protagonist at the beginning and the calm expression he shows now. With this, a familiar feeling began to fill his heart. It's as if a famous idol were calling our protagonist by name and showing affection. This left her speechless and extremely embarrassed, finding her new owner absolutely beautiful and perfect. Our protagonist even tries to deny her affection, but it's no use as she is completely melted. With complete innocence, the prince claims that Rhinel loves to be petted. He also takes the opportunity to vent, saying that up until that moment, everyone around him had tried to sabotage or betray him. but the presence of his newest crow friend can completely improve his day. This friendship makes the prince consider the possibility of not returning to the imperial palace and just living with his new pet bird. But this possibility is quickly discarded as he refuses to live like that. The man cannot ignore the sacrifice of the knights who gave their lives to protect him. If he continues to hide, many citizens will suffer under tyranny's rule. This thought drives him to want to return to the imperial palace immediately. However, he must act cautiously, as a hasty return could compromise his position as heir, since Llewellyn is prepared to usurp his place. He needs to increase his ambition as quickly as possible, aiming to achieve the true potential of the imperial family, known for the power to transform into a wolf. Meanwhile, our protagonist continues her search for medicinal herbs, hurrying to collect them before night falls. But something surprises her and makes her act cautiously. Our dear bird managed to spot something shiny due to her sharp vision. Looking closer, she realized that this shine came from a precious blue jewel. This made her question why such a rare mineral was in the middle of the forest. She plans to ignore this jewel, but her crow instinct won't allow it. This makes our protagonist head towards the shine unconsciously. These senses make her feel extreme embarrassment for not being able to control herself. She tries to remind herself that she is human and cannot give in to these urges that destroy her dignity. However, the crow soon realized that it was familiar with this jewel that was previously unknown. This stone was used in one of her games based on light novels. This is not a jewel but a fruit known as the Croban stone, which has the power to awaken latent potential in whoever consumes it. Our protagonist remembers that this fruit can only be used once during the entire game campaign and can directly affect the story's ending. Additionally, if this stone is given to a low-interest character, they might not withstand the side effects and die. Due to this fruit, our dear human had to restart her progress in the campaign several times. This discovery made our protagonist finally realize that this world is actually part of a game she played 3 years ago. Obviously, this made her curse fate for being transported to a shoujo game whose name she doesn't remember. Fortunately, all this chaos has a positive side, as the crow finally remembered the identity of the man she saved. This prince is a secondary character who can become the main one if his quest is completed. The crown prince of the Bolfric Empire is injured and being hunted, which made our protagonist deduce that she was transported to this world during the time of Khamid. She remembers that during this time, Khamid himself still had to gain his power and face many challenges, and it seems our protagonist received the important mission to help him awaken and reach his full potential. So she must give him the fruit immediately to help him. This entire journey fills her with hope, believing that when Khamid's authority awakens, she will be able to return to her original world. The crow finally delivers the fruit into the young prince's hands, who is confused by this sudden gift. He realized that the Croban stone is something that not even the imperial family can obtain, making him believe that his bird is some kind of prophet. He states that if he eats the fruit, his destiny will change completely. Although this could help him overcome the desperate situation he is in, there is a risk of death if he cannot withstand the full power of the fruit. Obviously, this is a very difficult decision due to the possibility of death, which makes the prince quite thoughtful. Looking up, he calls for Rainel, his most faithful companion. In a remarkable gesture, he gives his friend permission to live freely in case he dies. After this ceremony, he consumes the fruit, hoping to change his destiny. Suddenly, an overwhelming golden light starts emanating from his body like a cyan aura. This entire explosion leaves our protagonist quite surprised, since in her original game, Prince Khamid was already awakened after consuming the stone. Due to his awakening, our dear blonde feels much more powerful, as if he had overloaded his full potential. The animals around began to flee due to their instincts related to the crown prince. However, all this latent power also attracted various enemies, like a horde of werewolves. This left our protagonist quite worried and irritated that her master was interrupted in the middle of his ascension. She decides to flee and hide after the awakening is completed, as she no longer considers herself useful to her master. However, that memory of friendship still bothers her a lot. The werewolves prepare to attack while hurling curses at the crow. Our protagonist just needs to hold on until Khamid's ascension is over, when suddenly an explosion of aura occurred inside the dear prince's body. His skin begins to crack, forming golden lightning bolts that extend all over his body. All this creates excruciating pain that is extremely difficult to bear. The The pain is so intense that Kalmit prefers to die rather than endure it. But he cannot give up, as many people depend on this awakening, giving him the motivation to endure all that pain. The prince starts to have visions of his subordinates, giving their lives to save him. These memories make him decide that he cannot die this way under any circumstances. When God created this world, the divine animals beside him began to guide the animals that existed there. They shared their powers with those who resembled God. This was so that humans could wisely lead the planet, being at the top of the animal hierarchy. When suddenly Kalmit transmutes his form into a majestic golden wolf, ready to protect. The sight fills our protagonist with relief, allowing her to finally rest after enduring numerous injuries. After affirming this, she falls to the ground, leaving her owner very worried. The prince says that Rheinel was supposed to flee as ordered instead of continuing to help him. This attitude makes the young man trust our protagonist even more, considering her a great friend and companion. Kalmit states that if she had obeyed him, she would not be in such a deplorable situation. All this attention makes our dear protagonist quite embarrassed for feeling powerless. After getting rid of the werewolves, the prince focuses on finding a way to care for his crow, who was badly injured. After a certain time, our protagonist wakes up feeling a lot of pain. Sometime later, our protagonist woke up feeling a piercing pain. When she opened her eyes, she had a blurred vision of her owner, who was begging the man to heal Rheinel. Suddenly, a kind of blue magic is cast toward our protagonist. The magical energy envelops the crow, who is surprised by the immense healing power it carries. After the spell is completed, our protagonist wakes up showing nervousness and helplessness. In this desperation, Prince Kalmit tries to calm his crow, saying that everything is okay. After calming down, our protagonist decides to fly into her master's arms as a way to show affection. He reveals that Rheinel is under the protection of one of his most loyal knights, and then introduces the doctor who cared for her. Given these facts, our dear bird realizes that her body no longer hurts. This makes our protagonist question if these are the effects of some divine power provided by her presence in this fantasy world. After the healing process is completed, the sorcerer decides to leave the house and exit through the door. Returning to the ceremony, the prince resumes the idea that he is really happy with the state of health of his bird. He also takes the opportunity to say that he was very afraid that our protagonist would not wake up. Obviously, this made her quite embarrassed, making her blush with shame. The reason for such embarrassment was the fact of receiving so much attention even though she is just a crow. This situation frustrates her deeply as her non-human body prevents any possibility of a closer relationship. In the end, the prince will marry someone else, leading our protagonist to think that if she is alone, he should be too. This all creates a very comical scene where the crow caws as a form of protest against this marriage structure. In this situation, Kalmit, hearing the caw, thought he might have hugged his pet too tightly, causing all this commotion. He claims that he is really very happy to see our protagonist wake up completely healthy, since the prince is only alive thanks to the help of our dear crow. This help was shown both in the escape from the orcs and in the supply delivery and mutual aid that they exchanged. Moreover, our protagonist helped him to awaken completely. For all these listed reasons, Kalmit felt extremely guilty for putting his dear friend in danger. This makes him promise that under no circumstances will he abandon our protagonist. Obviously, she was quite embarrassed by this sudden declaration of love. After all this conversation, our protagonist realized the extreme admiration she has for this young man, refusing to see him belong to another person. Because of this, our protagonist decides to peck any woman who dares to get involved with Kalmit, when suddenly a voice intervenes from outside, calling for His Highness. The prince grants permission, and this person enters the room. This young man introduces himself as Sulagalenos and offers his condolences to His Majesty, claiming to be happy to see him safe. Kalmit quickly apologizes for invading the guard's residence without prior notice. However, our protagonist seems to know this man from the game she played in her past life, but unfortunately, she cannot remember what type of character he was. The man claims he bitterly regrets not being able to protect his master. Because of his regret, he decides to take his own life to pay his debt. Obviously, this unexpected decision leaves our dear Prince Kalmit quite surprised, when suddenly he snatches a sword from his subordinate's hand. With this, the sword falls to the ground with a thundering force. After performing the act, the prince says he appreciates the knight's loyalty, but he cannot be so crazy as to take his own life. Our protagonist was also very happy with the prince's action. After all, he saved a life. But even so, Garlinos did not show contentment with his superior's decision. Seeing this situation, the prince tries to console his knight, saying that he does not need to feel so guilty since it was not his fault. While extending his hand, Khalmyd claims to be very happy just because the knight is not on Llewellyn's side. Obviously, Garlinos felt very comforted by this action and all the help the prince was giving. Furthermore, Khalmyd decides to make him his most loyal subordinate, who will be his sword and protect him. Faced with all this honor, the knight decides to accept the proposal, extending the sword towards his master. After all this ceremony, our protagonist finally remembered what type of character he was. The original Garlinos from the game was a loyal knight of Khalmyd. The young man still promises loyalty to his new superior, even if he does not awaken his imperial power. And while handing the sword to his new subordinate, the prince decides to thank him immensely for his loyalty. But something still bothers our protagonist, since she does not know the reason why Khalmyd is hiding his awakening from such loyal people. And after calming down, the prince and the subordinate sit at the table and begin to update all the situations happening in the kingdom. And in the middle of the conversation, the young prince calls his crow to keep him company. Obviously, the presence of this bird left the knight Garlinos quite surprised and confused. And pausing to think, he realized that His Majesty had a lot of intimacy with this bird. But this made him even more confused. After all, why would a member of the royal family have a crow that represents bad luck? But the prince explained that the bird saved him from orcs and found medicinal herbs, claiming that if it were not for its presence, he would be dead now. Obviously, Garlinos found this whole situation very poetic. After all, the prince had never shown a trace of vulnerability. After all, the slightest mistake could cost his life, since he is a member of the royal family and takes many risks. This whole situation is very poetic, since Khalmyd starts smiling warmly at the bird of death. Soon the knight realizes that his master is not an ordinary person, but a very special and gifted one. This makes Garlinos develop intense hatred for the crow. After all, a simple bird managed to save his master while a knight could do nothing. But after the questions ended, the prince decides to ask what was happening in the imperial palace during the entire period he was absent. After all, he's been missing all this time, and many things must have happened during this interval. Obviously, this sudden disappearance left everyone quite surprised. After all, the bodies of the knights were found, but His Highness's was not. Garlinos continues, claiming that the young prince cried, missing his brother, but this did not make sense to Khalmyd. After all, this same prince hated him and wanted to take his throne. Because of this, the emperor issued an imperial decree following the prince's requests. Faced with this complicated situation, our protagonist could do nothing but observe. After all, she is just a crow. Furthermore, she finds it very sad that the brothers have to fight to the death to win a mere throne. Because of this, she decides to try to calm her master by acting like a simple pet. And obviously, the prince is very moved by this situation. After all, the bird helps him immensely. He orders his subordinate to inform his father that he is alive, but he is not entirely calm because the third prince is planning to usurp the throne. And so, a war for the throne, starring two brothers, begins. But so far, everything is going according to Khalmyd's plans. Suddenly, we are transported to a beautiful flower field. In this very place, our protagonist is observing the various flowers present in the environment, and she is happy to finally be visiting the imperial palace. She is quite excited because she had only seen the palace in illustrations in the game, and now she can see it in person. But she has to stay focused on her mission. After all, in this same palace is the enemy of Prince Khalmyd, and in these times, she is even grateful for not being human. After all, if she were, she would be considered guilty for the prince's disappearance. So for now, it is safer for her to remain as the prince's peculiar pet. When suddenly, our protagonist is caged. After all, she is still a bird. The prince apologizes, claiming that this cage will only be used until they arrive. However, our protagonist doesn't care about that. She is extremely irritated by being trapped in this cage. This entire situation reminds her of the time she was a zookeeper, where there were sad times when animals had to be transported in cages. and she had a lot of trouble restraining the more restless animals. But now that she is in this situation, she realizes it is much worse than she imagined. After finally leaving the carriage, the prince takes her somewhere. But this simple shaking of the cage makes our protagonist quite dizzy and nauseous. When night falls, the prince decides to take the bird out of the cage to check if it is okay. However, the only response he got was a nice bite. After all, our protagonist is very irritated with this whole situation. But the prince didn't take it too seriously. After all, this same bird had saved his life in various moments before. This makes him apologize for putting her in the cage. After all, it was necessary to enter the palace. And with a simple caress, she decides to accept the apology since she is quite happy. And the reason she went with the prince is that he didn't want to return to the palace without the company of his best friend. But it seems that this relationship is not limited to friendship because Kalmuk decided to kiss his bird, and this act resulted in a very strange scene. Obviously, our protagonist was absurdly embarrassed and confused by this sudden action from the prince. While the bird remains in shock, we see Kalmuk simply continue with his explanation, pretending nothing happened. He calmly explains that the only person he can trust is his crow. After all, he is only saying all this because his animal cannot respond. If our protagonist were human, she probably would not have seen this side of the prince. After all, he is a very reserved person. In the midst of all this affection, Kalmuk thanks his crow immensely for always being there to protect and help him. After many hours, they finally arrive at the palace, the place that will house many internal conflicts. Our bird is enchanted with the room since it is quite luxurious and very beautiful. This room is the prince's room, one of the richest rooms in the city. This place is gilded with gold, with a very beautiful fireplace and several luxurious paintings. Obviously, our protagonist is attracted to the gold. After all, she is subject to the crow's instincts, which are drawn to shiny things. But all this joy is interrupted when the prince announces that he will have to leave to resolve some important matters. He orders his bird to stay in that place until he returns to avoid danger. And as a precaution, he orders a butler to take good care of his crow. And he even threatens the poor man, claiming that if he treated his bird badly, he would face severe consequences. However, the butler was relieved to see that his master had left the room, as now he would have a moment of peace without threats. He questions why he was tasked with taking care of a bird that represents death and bad luck. In this situation, he decides to just feed it, as he doesn't want to suffer any consequences. But as we know, it is common knowledge that crows eat worms, so the butler decided to give them to our protagonist. But she did not seem very happy with this feast, as worms are disgusting. However, the poor butler doesn't know this. He doesn't know that our protagonist is a human, and therefore decides to feed her like a normal crow. Meanwhile, on the other side of the palace, the prince could hear the scream of his bird, which was quite irritated about not receiving a proper meal. He is very concerned about the well-being of his crow, as they had never been apart for so long. When suddenly someone starts walking through the room, calling for his brother. This someone was the feared third prince, Llewellyn. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room becomes tense, as Kalmuk must act cautiously in front of the one who wants to usurp his throne. Llewellyn claims he was very worried since his brother had disappeared suddenly while he was hunting, and he says this was very dangerous since Kalmuk had not yet had his awakening. But the third prince doesn't know that he did have his ascension in the middle of the forest. For now, though, Kalmuk can do nothing but continue with his brother's childish games. He apologizes for being unpleasant and for worrying his younger brother. Obviously, these words made the third prince very irritated, as nothing went as planned. In this situation, we see that Kalmuk is very attentive, as his brother could explode at any moment. At least something positive happened. Llewellyn was only supported by people who believed he was the only awakened one in the family. And due to all this fame, the third prince became known for his innocence and arrogance, as he never made an effort for anything. And now he didn't realize that his brother had also awakened, as he was too foolish to perceive this. Kalmuk claims he will make an effort not to worry his brother again, and after this conversation, he simply decides to leave to meet his father. Upon entering the royal hall, he encounters two guards who remain vigilant for any sign of danger. When he arrives, he kneels before his father, who is surprisingly lying in bed due to some illness. The king then says he is very happy to know that his son is safe, as he thought he had died. But Karmit doesn't care about that. He only wants to know about his father's health. Surprisingly, the king realizes that his son had awakened, as he is his father and can perceive everything. He even jokes with the prince, saying this is why his brother is so hard on him. Obviously, Karmit is very happy to realize that his father is still perceptive and hasn't completely lost his awareness despite his illness. Suddenly, the friendly atmosphere turns negative when Karmit threatens his father to greet the empress who misses him. He merely orders his father to remain in this horrible state until only one survives. Faced with all these threats, the king realizes he made a mistake in raising his firstborn, as he has become quite arrogant. As he leaves the room, the prince tells his father that if his condition does not worsen due to the illness, the means of succession to the throne will be manipulated. Hearing this, the only reaction the king has is to start laughing, as he is almost dying anyway. He is also happy to realize that his son has finally gained a fighting spirit, the spirit necessary to defeat the third prince. And it seems the king's wife had died in some accident, which is why he is ill. However, he wishes his son well and hopes he finds his place and can smile in the end. Meanwhile, we see that our protagonist is starving, as birds have quick digestion, which makes them very hungry throughout the day. However, our protagonist also refuses to eat the insects she is offered, as they are disgusting. Her only hope is that the prince returns soon, until she looks at the plate and starts to hallucinate from hunger, and her crow instincts take over. With a fearful look, she wonders if she should try just one. After all, our protagonist has the organs of a crow, and technically this should change her palate as well. But no, she refuses to give in to this because she is human. She cannot surrender to her animal instincts. And she was so blinded by her instincts that she almost lost her humanity. To her happiness, the prince returns and is very concerned about the condition of his bird. He orders the butler to bring meats and fruits immediately because the crow does not eat insects. Finally, after a long period of hunger, our protagonist can enjoy some quality food. Suddenly, Karmit calls his bird, saying he has something to give her. He says he wants to give her a gift to celebrate her entrance into the palace. It is revealed that inside the chest are pounds and pounds of precious stones, which obviously attract our protagonist's crow instincts. She wonders how much all these jewels cost, since they seem very expensive. However, our protagonist still does not understand the reason for receiving all these gifts, since she is still just a mere bird. Karmit asks if the crow liked the gift, as it was quite costly. As a way of thanking him, the crow decides to give a jewel as a gift to her master. He is very happy with this gesture, since he did not expect our protagonist to act this way. In this situation, he promises her that when he becomes emperor, he will make the crow a national bird. Suddenly, the scene changes, and we see the crow flying over the royal palace, looking very happy with all the freedom she has been given. Obviously, the gardeners and all the staff present are quite confused by the fact that a bird symbolizing bad luck is flying freely over the palace. In this situation, the gardener decides to hunt the bird, fearing some reprimand from his superiors, when someone intervenes from outside, telling him not to kill the bird. This person is the prince, who ordered his subordinate not to hunt the birds anymore. After all, this crow is his treasure, and if it is injured, the prince will not be at peace. This makes the gardener run away, questioning why the rich have such strange tastes. This makes Karmit start thinking about a way to handle this situation. He needs to find a way to inform the staff that his bird cannot be harmed. Suddenly, a mysterious person begins to approach the garden. This person is the third prince, who is looking for his brother. He claims he didn't find him in his room or his office, so he thought he had disappeared again. In this sibling rivalry, our protagonist can do nothing but start creating hashtags related to employment. Anyway, Karmit is curious about why his brother is suddenly appearing there. This makes him think that the third prince has a lot of free time to just walk around the castle. These provocations make the atmosphere quite intense, since they are two brothers fighting for the throne. Finally, the third prince begins to reveal the reason that brought him there. He asks his brother if he really wants to continue with this idea of taking the throne for himself. The prince quickly agrees and says he does plan to become king. They question who will be the next to be crowned and who will die trying. Finally, the third prince reveals his nature by calling his brother a miserable insect who did not have an awakening. But Karmit quickly retorts that even though his brother has awakened, he still has not completely conquered the throne. He claims that while he was missing, the third prince had his best chance to obtain the throne, but simply wasted it due to his arrogance. And so he gets into his brother's head, saying that he is a pathetic fool who, even awakened, cannot conquer a simple throne. This made the third prince so angry that he activated his awakening, transforming into a kind of human-tiger hybrid. But Khalid had expected his brother to act this way in a fit of rage. However, he did not count on the fact that his brother's transformation was stronger than he had imagined. This new form is more powerful than a tiger, a dog, or a wolf. This makes our dear prince think of a way to get out of that situation. When, to our surprise, our protagonist lunged at the animal's head, thus saving her master. The impact was so strong that it caused a scar on the wolf's head. This blow was also strong enough to make the third prince bleed. She screams, saying she can be more powerful than a spoiled boy. The prince is then shocked by his bird's actions. After all, she managed to save his life. But he cannot let his bird fight alone. After all, she is very fragile and can die from any attack. Due to all these provocations, the third prince decides to attack our protagonist, aiming to put an end to this. But Khalid quickly intervenes in the fight, kicking the dog's stomach. The impact of this attack was so powerful that his brother fell to the ground, transformed. And the prince took the opportunity to taunt, saying that his brother is as dumb as the wolf. With this, he also claimed that the blood of the imperial family does not belong to a dog. But the third prince doesn't care about that. He is blinded by hatred and vengeance, and tells his brother to shut up. With this provocation, Khalid starts to say that he really did not awaken, but even without the awakening, he is still stronger than a mere dog. He also calls his little brother weak and pathetic, and that this wolf form is useless. Now completely shaken, the third prince decides to withdraw, promising revenge. As we already know, Khalid awakened in the forest, but it wouldn't be interesting to reveal that at this moment. After all, for him to fight against Llewellyn, he needs many followers and a strong base within the imperial family. And now, with the battle finally won, the prince calls the crow to his arms. However, surprisingly, Khalid called her to reprimand her reckless actions. The prince is scolding our protagonist for attacking an awakened human without thinking about the consequences. But in this situation, our protagonist uses her tricks to make a cute face to soften Khalid's heart. This tactic really worked and made him feel bad for scolding such a cute animal. But he soon regained control of the situation and continued to criticize our protagonist's reckless actions. He questions her, asking what she would have done if she'd have been attacked and killed. And obviously, this left our dear bird quite confused about the situation since she wouldn't know how to react. But the reason our protagonist managed to come out victorious from the confrontation was that in her past life, she had experience with animals. This helped her get out of the situation and defeat that wolf. However, the prince obviously doesn't know this. Therefore, the prince has the right to be angry about this situation since he doesn't know that his bird is a reincarnated person. In light of all this, the crow decided to apologize and accepted her master's affection. But for some reason, Khalid still seemed very confused about the situation. After all, he thinks our protagonist is some kind of ancestor or dragon who can easily handle Llewellyn's attacks. This makes him start to doubt his theory, pondering the possibility that Rainel is just a normal crow. And faced with this uncertainty, he decides to protect his bird with all his might. After all, he won't be defeated so easily now that he's awakened. And even in this overwhelming situation, he manages to let out a pure and happy smile. Meanwhile, we see Prince Llewellyn destroying everything in the adjacent room. He is really furious for losing so disgracefully to his brother. This makes him cry with anger, going into shock and putting his hand over his face. He recalls that the decisive factor in his defeat was the presence of that crow. All that intervention and attitude make the prince have an intense desire for revenge against our dear protagonist. And in this situation, he plans that his first decree as emperor will be to exterminate all crows. But suddenly, something intrigues the young prince. After all, why would his brother have risked so much for a bird? With a malicious look, the prince decides to take advantage of this situation and investigate it further. And with this, he turns to the mirror behind him. And with a meticulous movement, he extends his palm over the mirror and says that this is an order from the temporary emperor. He commands his mirror to create the item he requests. When suddenly, we glimpse the figure of a bearded man emerging from the mirror. He complies with the emperor's orders, saying he will follow all his requests. Sometime later, we see that the prince is busy with his daily royal tasks, and his bird seemed quite lazy in this situation since he was not used to so much work. When suddenly, the prince hears a voice from outside, alerting him that a marquis named Namiel has come to visit. Kamut proceeds and says that he may enter. This marquis appeared to be a young man with white hair who alerted the prince that the requested item was already ready. Prince Kamut was astonished by the absurd speed with which the item was made. However, even with all this friendly environment, our protagonist does not seem comfortable at all and begins to advance towards the young man. She questions if this is really Namiel. He is introduced as Charmant Namiel, a wizard older than the Duke, and he is a very important character in the game our protagonist played in her past life. After all, he is the main character of the game's story. Given this situation, the bird became very happy and embarrassed. After all, it met the protagonist of its favorite game. Namiel starts laughing and says it's the first time he's met such a friendly crow. But Prince Kamut did not seem comfortable with this situation at all. After all, he had never seen his bird so comfortable around other people. So the prince calls his crow and tells it to stop causing trouble with the guest. And after this touch of reality, our protagonist finally realized she was getting carried away. She starts apologizing, saying she is a loyal bird, but Kamut doesn't care and says he will reprimand her later. And seeing this whole situation, Namiel becomes very interested in this bird. After all, it is the first time he has seen a crow understand human language so well. And so the Marquis would like to take the crow to his laboratory for dissection. But the conversation was soon interrupted, and Namiel finally decided to show the item that had been ordered. This object was a cord that the prince himself had requested. The Marquis claims that Kamut insisted that the item be magical. And this leaves Namiel quite intrigued. After all, why would the prince go to so much trouble? Obviously, our protagonist starts thinking that Kamut is going to leave her, and she becomes very sad imagining this possibility. And that's why the bird can't accept that it is just a pet. When suddenly the prince places the necklace around his crow's neck, and obviously, this left the bird very intrigued and scared by the situation. He can't believe that Kamut ordered a cord just to gift a simple crow. The Marquis reveals that the prince asked for the necklace to adjust depending on the size of whoever wears it. Kamut agrees, saying that's why he made the request. And soon the atmosphere in the room becomes quite tense. After all, the Marquis wanted to dissect his bird. The prince is obviously suspicious. After all, several people are trying to cut off his head. But the Marquis quickly says that His Highness is the future of the nation and that he would never harm him. So Namiel says he will keep his eye open. After all, things can get quite complicated. But the Marquis quickly responds that his father advised him not to get involved in politics. After all, his father is a member of the imperial family who never awakened, so he decided to give up his throne and follow the path of magic. The Marquis also reveals that it was Prince Llewellyn who forced him to act. After all, to him, wizards are not even human but just tools. And for this reason, the Marquis decided to support Kamut. After all, if the third prince wins this dispute, he will surely hunt down all the present wizards. When surprisingly the prince asks if Namiel really trusts him. After all, people usually change when they come into contact with power. But our protagonist knows that Kamut would never do that. After all, he is a good person. But the Marquis says he knows the prince is not that kind of person, and seeing all this distrust from Kamut, he decides to take something out of his pocket. Namiel hands him a kind of magical item in exchange for his trust, when suddenly our protagonist recognized the magical item and named it the Croban Stone. The Marquis says this is the fruit that can unleash all the restricted power in a human body. And given this situation, our protagonist realized that this was the original reason Prince Kamut awakened in the game's original campaign without her interventions. This makes the bird start questioning what that stone it found was. The Marquis continues, saying that this is an extremely rare stone and worthy of his trust. Given this, our protagonist realizes she has changed the entire course of the original story. And obviously Prince Kamut questions why the Marquis himself did not eat the fruit. But he quickly responds that despite also having royal blood in his veins, he prefers to be a wizard. In any case, the prince showed he completely understood the situation. And after offering this gift, the Marquis asks if Kamut will accept his offer. The prince then proclaims that if he becomes emperor, he will repay all the help that Marquis Neniel has provided. The Seine responds by saying that if the prince becomes emperor, he will be at his service. And the Marquis hopes to be able to talk in peace now. After all, even though he has imperial blood, the next emperor should not address a mere noble in this manner. But as we know, Khamid is a very humble person who doesn't care much about these rules. And after the Marquis leaves the room, the prince begins to think about what he should do with this stone. After all, Khamid has already awakened, so he has to give this stone to someone he trusts. However, the only person the prince trusts is his bird, who is not human. But even so, Khamid starts to formulate hypotheses about what would happen if his bird swallowed the stone. Our protagonist also feels quite out of place in this situation. After all, she doesn't know what to do with this stone. Obviously, since Khamid is already awakened, the crowbone stone is not very useful. However, our protagonist's crow instincts strike again, and she begins to be fascinated by the stone's shine. She tries to resist, but her animal instincts are very strong. So the bird can no longer resist and holds the magic jewel in its mouth. Obviously, the prince was quite astonished by this situation. After all, if Rainelle ingests that stone, she might die. But our protagonist doesn't care. She simply decides to ingest the stone anyway. The prince was desperate in this situation. After all, his bird had just ingested a stone that could kill her. And if the awakening begins, perhaps Rainelle will not be able to endure it and perish during the process. And Khamid will have to watch her die without being able to do anything to interfere, and obviously, this greatly affects his psychological state. He will not be able to survive without his most faithful companion, and he would surely also perish along with his bird, until after a while, our protagonist shows signs of life again, and this ignites a flame of hope within the prince. Khamid realizes that nothing happened and that his bird was there in front of him healthy. After all this scare, Khamid decides to sit down to relieve some of the pressure. After all, his bird almost died. Our protagonist can't remember anything that happened during that time. She doesn't even remember ingesting the stone. In any case, this was a bit useful after all. She prevented someone else from ingesting that stone and having an unplanned awakening. The bird also laments not having had an awakening. After all, she remains just a weak crow when she could be an awakened crow. But it seems that nothing changed. She remains the same crow as always. When suddenly our protagonist starts feeling unwell and convulsing. She wonders if she is undergoing some kind of awakening, but her body is not glowing. Khamid shows considerable concern in this situation. After all, his crow simply stopped showing signs of life. When suddenly someone interrupts the situation, saying there is nothing wrong with the bird. The prince asks why his crow is in so much pain, but the doctor replies that he has no idea. After all, the magic would be absorbed if something were wrong, and in this case, it wasn't. All the prince can do is watch his crow's body burning with fever and not be able to do anything to help. He dismisses the doctor, telling him to leave the room, and after that, he sits with an enormous feeling of guilt and remorse. After all, his bird was in that state only because he obtained that stone. All of this makes him feel useless and afraid. He becomes a powerless person in this situation. And all the crown prince can do is pray for his bird to return to normal. Some time has passed since then, and the prince fell asleep from exhaustion after staying by his bird's side for hours. But something different happened. Our protagonist was teleported to some kind of cosmos. Looking at her hands, she realizes she is in some sort of astral human form. And in the midst of all this strange situation, she wonders if she is alive. When suddenly our protagonist starts to feel the wind on her face, and she is transported to some kind of flowery field along with the sun. She resumes her crow form, and the situation becomes much more abstract. Looking to the side, she sees her body in human form being surrounded by some kind of dark energy. A voice intervenes, saying that a long time ago, the bird closest to the sun helped the wolf and became one of its wings. The wolf ate the body of the human with whom it shared the power, a very dark and sad story. And to prevent the suffering of the survivors, the bird gave life to a creature called Crow. And it seems this bird is our protagonist, who is currently in a very abstract environment. Returning to the real world, we see Prince Khamid waking up after a poorly slept night. He regrets having fallen asleep at such an important moment. When looking to the side, he has a truly surprising vision. Suddenly, our protagonist transformed and became a human. However, her form is different. It's as if she has merged with the form of a crow. Obviously, the prince is very confused by this whole situation. After all, his bird had turned into a human without any explanation. Kalmit wonders if this person who had invaded his room was some kind of assassin or something. After all, he was a much-hunted prince. But he quickly dismisses this possibility. After all, what kind of assassin would sleep so peacefully in front of their target, when suddenly he notices that the necklace that was on his crow had been transported to this stranger's body? This makes him conclude that this person was his bird who had transformed, and analyzing the feathers, the prince realizes that indeed his crow had changed form. He begins to hypothesize that he might have gained human form because of the Kroban stone, when suddenly our protagonist wakes up from her deep and strange sleep. She asks if there is something wrong with Kamit, but he seems very confused by this situation. She asks if it's time to eat her worms. After all, she was a bird until recently. When suddenly she realizes that her hand has taken on a human form, and she begins to understand that she is no longer a crow. And what gives her a reality shock is realizing that her wings have been replaced by human limbs. Obviously, after living so long as a bird, she is very confused by the situation and decides to look for a mirror. But Kamit stops her, saying that she was heading for the exit. So he decides to take her to the mirror, and she is able to see her new human form. However, our protagonist noticed that her form is quite different from when she was a human in her past life. In her new form, her eyes shone like jewels and seemed to blend with her old crow form. She obviously begins to ponder the possibility that this was caused by the Krogan stone. But our protagonist still questions why she feels so weak even after awakening. She complains, saying that at least she could have kept her strong muscles from her past life. She says she lost all her muscles and that her new arms look like cotton swabs that can't even slap Llewellyn. But our protagonist simply decides to forget these negative points and focus on the fact that she finally became human again. Now she no longer needs to be trapped in a cage or eat disgusting worms. Besides, now she finally has the opportunity to live with Prince Kalmate, and he asks if Rainelle feels well after going through all this metamorphosis. Moreover, our protagonist went through a very suffocating situation of not even being able to speak due to her crow form. But now she can finally talk and hug others as she pleases. Given this new situation, she starts repeating Kalmate's name several times. After all, now she finally has the ability to call out his name. Since then, time has passed, and the prince asks if our protagonist is okay. She is still a little dazed, but responds yes, even though she is still crying from the surprise of seeing the difference in her form. But no matter how much she says she is fine, inside her head is a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. After all, she was a crow until recently. But she still doesn't intend to reveal that the whole world is actually made to be a game. After all, the prince would be quite shaken to know that his entire world was created only as a source of entertainment. So our protagonist decides to keep this a secret and not say anything about her reincarnation. And to hide this fact, our protagonist says that she was just afraid of dying after ingesting the Kroban stone. The prince also says that he was afraid his beloved bird would die in that situation. After all, he was praying with all his might for his faithful companion to recover. And he can't believe that his beloved pet has now become human. This makes him hug our protagonist tightly, saying that she has no idea of his happiness. Kalmit thanks her immensely for waking up, and obviously, our protagonist is very embarrassed by the situation. She doesn't even know how to react to so much direct affection from her beloved prince. Kalmit then asks if Rainelle is uncomfortable with the hug, but she doesn't seem to hear because she is so embarrassed. Amid this chaos, she wishes to return to her crow form to escape this embarrassing situation, and surprisingly her wish is granted. However, she still doesn't understand why she changed her form suddenly and is quite confused. Obviously, she still doesn't understand anything about the situation and seeks to understand the reasons for her latest metamorphosis. And since our dear protagonist is in a game, she ponders the possibility of having to buy a premium package to achieve a complete awakening. Given this situation, our dear crow becomes desperate and starts flying upwards, only to be stopped by Kamit, who tells her to calm down. He holds her in his arms and says he will teach her how to regain her human form. He puts our protagonist aside and says he will demonstrate his transformation first. And after saying this, he transmutes into a beautiful awakened golden wolf. Even our protagonist was quite scared of this wolf form. After all, the prince looked very intimidating. when suddenly they'd perform some kind of suspicious and strange greeting. Then suddenly Khalmyr returns to his human form and says it is our protagonist's turn to transmute. But she didn't understand anything from the prince's explanation. After all, he is a terrible teacher. He wonders if he didn't explain well enough. After all, in his mind his explanation was very clear. So the prince tells our protagonist to focus her thoughts on the human form, and then she will be able to transform again. But the bird is a bit dumb and still can't understand the explanation. When trying to practice this thought, our protagonist managed to become human again, and she was quite surprised at the ease of the process. And after all that lesson, they go to a banquet. Our protagonist is very happy after all. It had been a long time since she had eaten human food, due to the fact that she was a crow until recently and only ate worms. But Rhinel already knew how to use cutlery, and obviously, this left the prince quite intrigued. She still tries to hide the fact that she is a reincarnated person, so she says she observed her master using cutlery all the time and learned from that. This makes her think about being careful from now on. After all, she can't slip up regarding this. The prince says he will ask the servant to clear the table, so he asks our protagonist to return to her crow form. And she obeys, thus returning to her majestic animal form. The servant arrives and starts cleaning everything, while our protagonist brags about becoming a master in the art of transformation. This opens up a range of possibilities for our protagonist. After all, she can take full advantage of both bodies. She begins to ponder the fact that Khalmyr plans to use her abilities for espionage. After all, she is a very stealthy animal. And after clearing the table, the servant finally leaves the room. Then suddenly the prince apologizes to his crow. After all, he is hiding the fact that our protagonist is human for a simple whim. But she still doesn't understand why the prince is apologizing. And she still thinks about the possibility of being a crow spying on the third prince, or even pretending to be an innocent maid to take out Llewellyn. And she is willing to do all this, even though assassination is quite a heavy thing. After all this imagining, Khalmyr finally says what he wants from our protagonist, when surprisingly he only asks her to stay safe, a truly selfish request. And obviously she is quite surprised. After all, the prince could make much better use of her abilities. But Khalmyr doesn't care about that. After all, he is afraid of losing his most faithful friend to the third prince, who is an arrogant and greedy man, because our protagonist's human form would attract many dangers within the imperial palace. But she understands the prince's reasons. After all, he is only concerned about his most faithful friend. He then begs our protagonist to wait just a little longer. After all, when he becomes emperor, he will make this palace the safest place of all, where our protagonist can use any form she wants. She accepted this request very peacefully and plans to hide during this period. But our protagonist asks that in return the prince let her help in all his goals. He absorbed this information while hugging his most faithful bird, who had now become a human. But meanwhile, a crystal ball was watching the two, and the one watching them was the third prince, who knew the whole situation. Meanwhile, a man in a suit in the palace questions himself about why he failed. After all his plans were perfect, and the first prince shouldn't have survived. He made sure to execute the plan when the prince's guard wasn't present, also receiving a message that all the knights under Khalmyr's command had died. So he thought the prince had finally died. But something happened. After all, Khalmyr survived all those obstacles. Moreover, the prince took advantage of the situation to say that he was giving his all to obtain the right of succession to the throne. So the man questions whether his judgment was wrong and if he made a mistake in his plan. After all, the only reason the nobles supported the third prince was because of his awakening. Since in this world, the wolf represents a symbol of honor, and the one who conquers this symbol will become a legend who can lead the empire. And that's why those who are awakened are the closest to nobility. These ideas were created by Khalmyr, a very strong mercenary in this fantastical world. So only because of this awakening did the nobles decide to support the third prince, even though he does not fulfill the true qualifications to become the emperor. After all, the only way to maintain the glory of the empire is by placing an awakened person on the throne. But the man doesn't know what will happen to him now that the first prince survived. Moreover, the third prince abandoned him, calling him an incompetent marquis. And this obviously shook him, leaving him at a loss. He needs to make a decision, of which he has two options. The first is to live an isolated life where he will always be at risk of being killed. The second is to find a different path to follow. when suddenly, the man encounters our protagonist with a very frightening expression. Obviously, he is startled by the sight of a crow in the middle of nowhere. After all, how can a bird of death be on the first prince's shoulder? And it seems it was Marquis Wilhelm himself who decided to meet with Kamut. The bird has this suspicious look. After all, it was this same Marquis who planned the prince's assassination. And obviously, the man trembled in the presence of these two. Given this, the Marquis formulated a hypothesis that this crow was a warning of his death. The poor man thinks he will lose his life if he says anything wrong. However, the Marquis says he did not come to apologize for the assassination attempt, but Kamut, perceptive as always, realizes something is wrong. After all, this man only supports the third prince because he is an awakened person. However, he failed to kill Kamut, so he was simply abandoned and dismissed from his position. And he had no choice but to go to the first prince to seek refuge. And after making this superb deduction, Kamut asks if he hit the nail on the head. And obviously, the Marquis was quite surprised by the young heir's deductive ability. He begins to develop an admiration for the first prince, realizing that he has the necessary qualifications to become an emperor. Given this, he decides to kneel and swear loyalty. But Kamut warns that this action is very dangerous. Even so, the Marquis continues with his decision, admitting that he was a human who made a terrible choice and is now dealing with the consequences of his actions. So he decides to abandon everything and leave his fate in the hands of the first prince. And he knows that the Marquis is capable of helping him. Even so, Kamut does not show complete trust in the man. After all, he has switched sides once and can do so again. He then warns the Marquis, saying that he will receive many dirty looks and be the target of many attacks, but he must remain faithful. And with a look of confirmation, he says he accepts all these conditions. Sometime later, our protagonist questions the fact that the prince spared the life of the person who tried to kill him. And Kamut quickly responds that this action will bring more benefits to him in the long run. After all, the nobles will gradually change sides. Even so, our protagonist says the prince must be very angry, and he agrees but says he must be cautious. Furthermore, because of that assassination attempt, he met our protagonist still in crow form. She agrees, saying that in any case, it is true. And after that, he gives a sincere smile and asks if he can say something. Kamut asks our protagonist why she helped him when he was injured. After all, a human on the brink of death is not at all important to crows. Obviously, our protagonist was a bit indecisive about how to answer. After all, she can't say she is reincarnated. So, after thinking for a bit, she decides to use the old trick, saying that the prince's hair glowed in the sunlight, and that was why she helped him, using the excuse that she didn't even know she was a dragon ancestor and just thought she was an ordinary crow. In any case, Kamut was very happy with this answer and decided to stand up. Thus, his precious Rainelle will continue to admire him. But our protagonist thinks all this is madness, and she transforms into a crow again to escape that embarrassing situation. Faced with this, our protagonist decides to do everything she can to help Kamut achieve his goals. Some time has passed since then, and the prince was attending to his affairs along with his most loyal guard, warning about Galenos, who is facing a serious problem. The guard immediately volunteers to resolve the issue for His Highness. But Galenos still questions what the problem could be since everything seemed to be going well with Kamut's plans. After all, now the first prince has the support of the Marquis, which could help him confront his brother. Moreover, those nobles who remained neutral during the assassination began secretly swearing loyalty to Kamut as well. This means that the power of the first prince is gradually growing, so why would he be so worried? The guard begins to ponder the possibility of something serious and absurdly terrible. He starts to draw his sword as a form of protection and asks His Highness to inform him. He swears with his sword that he will solve all and any problems for the future emperor. But the prince's most feared problem was that his crow refused to follow him during these days. Obviously, the guard is very confused by this, as it seems like a very trivial problem. But Kamut doesn't care at all about that and decides to ask his guard for advice. However, Galenos can't think of anything other than blaming that crow for making His Highness worried. The guard begins to blame himself, saying it was his duty to save the prince instead of a mere bird. But now it's too late, and therefore Galenos decides to do his best to make the prince forget about that crow. Taking advantage of this, the guard begins to give wrong advice to His Highness. Faced with this situation, all the guard can say is that he is ready for any battle and to help his master. Meanwhile, in the room, our dear bird was hiding from the maids doing the morning cleaning. After all, our protagonist was quite bored of just watching and having no source of entertainment during the day. Since the moment the Marquis swore loyalty to the prince, our protagonist decided to distance herself to shed the image of bad omen. After all, several nobles will start negotiating with the prince, and a crow cannot accompany him. The last thing the guests expect to see is a mere bird that brings bad luck on the shoulder of the next emperor. After all, our protagonist has already dealt with many people, and they all found her quite repulsive. And even though she knows nothing about this world, she understands that the crow carries a heavy symbol of bad omen.